create jobs in this country, who will invest in our manufacturing sector, who will invest in the steel and aluminum sector.
The Prime Minister says he wants to build, baby, build, but he can't even get the BC NDP to build Canadian ships for Canadian taxpayers in Canada. Instead, this Liberal government is letting BC Ferries send good-paying union jobs to a Chinese shipyard, even as China punishes our exporters with tariffs.
The honourable member for Okanagan Lake West, South Kelowna.
Mr. Speaker, despite having world-class shipbuilders like Seaspan in Vancouver, BC Ferries has chosen a Chinese state-owned enterprise to build 4 new ships, even though the Prime Minister has declared China the biggest security threat to Canada. Meanwhile, the Liberals are providing BC Ferries with $36 million with no conditions to protect Canadian workers. Will the minister grow a spine of Canadian manufactured steel and make Canadian jobs a requirement for this funding, or will she side with Premier Eby in selling out our ship and steel building industries?
Mr. Speaker, our government will always side with Canadian workers, particularly our steel and aluminum sectors that are being battered right now. I was disappointed and concerned when I learned of this procurement, particularly at this moment when Canadian workers need our support. BC Ferries is entirely under provincial jurisdiction. The support BC Ferries receives from Transport Canada is entirely for operations and there is no capital expenditure.
Good day, my fellow Canadians. This is Dan Knight. And I just want to let you guys know what happened. Canada handed over a $1 billion shipbuilding contract funded by Canadian taxpayers to a Chinese state-owned company. And the ships, no, they're not for China. They're not for the South China Sea. They're for Canadian waters, our waters. Let that sink in for a moment. The same regime that's been spying on our MPs, slapping tariffs on our pork and beef, threatening Taiwan, and undermining Canadian exports is now getting paid by Ottawa and Victoria to build our ships with your tax dollars, while Canadian shipyards sit idle and Canadian workers get nothing. Now, let's talk about David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia. For the last year, he's been pandering around with slogans like Buy BC, build here, support local jobs. It's just been his mantra until it wasn't. Because when BC Ferries, a crown corporation fully owned by his government, put out a tender for 4 major vessels, where'd it go? The Weihai shipyard in China, a company that builds naval support vessels for the Chinese military. Let me be very clear. David's government is the sole contractor of BC Ferries. They appoint the board, they approve the budgets. They could have stopped this with one phone call, but they didn't. Instead, they sent the work overseas and left Canadian welders, steel workers, and engineers wondering if Buy BC was just another campaign slogan. And let's not forget about Ottawa. Let's not forget, the federal government kicked in $36 million to support BC Ferry operations. That's your money. That's federal cash. It came with 0 conditions. Not a single clause demanding for Canadian content. Not one word requiring about Canadian jobs. Then came the spin, because Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Transport, yes, that's now her portfolio. She was the former Deputy Prime Minister, for those who aren't paying attention at home. She was one of the most powerful figures in Trudeau's federal government, stood in Parliament and said, it's not our jurisdiction. Really? That's the excuse. Because here's the truth. Those ferry routes, they're part of Canada's national highway system. That's right. Legally, they're considered federally integrated transportation corridors. They're highways. And the federal government has every right, every responsibility to demand Canadian content when it funds infrastructure on those routes. So why didn't they? Well, it's either incompetence or because they didn't want to. And then there's Mark Carney, Trudeau's former banker turned prime minister. He's the man who now is promising a Made in Canada revival, jobs in steel and aluminum manufacturing. He gives speeches about rebuilding our industrial core, and at the same time, his government watches while those billion-dollar contracts go to China. This isn't about just one bad decision. It's about an entire worldview of the political class on full display. They pretend to stand for Canadian workers. They claim to care about sovereignty, while outsourcing critical infrastructure to a geopolitical rival. They cry about the climate, then send contracts to the world's dirtiest industrial polluter, China. And if this wasn't deliberate, if this wasn't coordinated from the top down, then it was pure, unfiltered incompetence. Either way, the results are the same. Canadian steelworkers lose, Canadian farmers suffer under these Chinese tariffs, and Canadians are taxing the bill, or tax the bill, and Beijing cashes the check. So the next time David Eby or Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland tells you they're fighting for Canadian jobs, remember this moment. Remember what they actually did when it counted, because they didn't fight. They didn't even lift a finger. The federal government had every opportunity to step in. The federal government could have said, not so fast. If this is Canadian infrastructure, it needs to be funded, and it's funded with Canadian dollars. It should be built in Canada. They could have tabled a targeted subsidy, a bridge grant, or a domestic shipbuilding incentive to help local yards compete. They could have partnered with the provinces to shore up Canadian supply chains. They could have enforced procurement rules that prioritize national industry. They did none of that. Instead, they watched quietly as BC Ferries outsourced the work to Chinese state-owned military contractor. And then they told you it was provincial jurisdiction, as if that phrase magically absolves them from responsibility, while federal money flowed freely into the project. Let's be clear, this wasn't a passive failure. It was an active decision not to act, a conscious choice not to intervene, not to protect Canadian jobs, and not to even uphold even a bare minimum of made in Canada industrial strategy. Let's be clear, they folded completely, and they hoped you wouldn't notice. They hoped that the headlines would fade, the outrage would pass, and that their hollow talking points would cover the betrayal. But we notice, and we're not forgetting. We're not moving on, and we're not letting this go, because this isn't just about the ferries. This isn't just about a contract. It's about what kind of country we are, and the kind of future we want. Do we want to build here with Canadian hands, Canadian steel, and Canadian pride? Or do we want to be the beholdens of the U.S. Supply chain? Do we want to become a branch plant economy, outsourcing our strength, our sovereignty, and our dignity to Beijing? This was a moment to build Canada strong. Instead, they chose build China strong. Is this what David Eby and Mark Carney believe is economic development? If this is their vision of leadership, then they've failed the people of this country. And if this is what they're delivering, then let's be honest. We need an election, and we need it now. Because this country belongs to the people who built it, not to the politicians who sold it out.